All right, it looks like we have a good amount of people signed up, so let's jump in. So like I said before, we're really excited to share all this research we have here today with you. What we did was we combined the data sets and expertise we have across the BuzzSumo, Brandwatch, and Falcon teams, and pulled a massive data set, looking at emojis and reaction use online with about 20 billion usage of emojis and reactions, primarily across the first half of 2021, the first 6 months of the year. So really interesting data set. We're going to break down some of the key findings. We're going to give you some hopefully implementable advice and also make sure we save time for Q&A at the end of the call. So if you do have any questions, pop them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. So my name's Evan. I oversee customer success for BuzzSumo, and I'm lucky enough to be joined today by Shruti from Falcon and Ksenia from Brandwatch, who are real marketing experts and are able to add their takes and insights onto this call. We also have Eleanor and Louise from the BuzzSumo team in the chat, so they'll be manning the chat box. But if you have any questions, just put them in the Q&A. We'll make sure we get over to it. And I'll let Shruti and Ksenia introduce themselves in a second, but just want to add in, it'd be interesting to hear your favorite emoji as well.
Sure. Hey everyone, I'm Shruti and I'm the content team lead at Falcon.io. I'm super stoked to be here and I'm really excited to show you our findings. This is actually our first collaborative project between BuzzSumo, Falcon, and Brandwatch. So super excited to take you through what we've found so far and what actionable insights you can get from this data as well. And as for your question, Evan, my favorite emoji is the side eye. Super sassy, super dramatic, totally fits my vibe, or so I say myself. But yeah, I love that emoji.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ksenia Newton. I'm a marketing content specialist at Brandwatch. Really excited to be here and really learn from Falcon, from BuzzSumo, and share all the different insights that we have. My two favorite emojis are the upside down emoji as well as the grimacing emoji. I think they're both extremely versatile, especially when it comes to me trying to escape the conversation. I'll just add that grimace and that would be it. But funny thing is, I literally just looked up the meaning behind the grimacing emoji and I realized that I might have been using it all wrong. And apparently it says it conveys a wide range of moderately negative emotions, which is really not what I've been trying to say with this for the last at least year and a half. So I'm really excited again to be here and kind of learn more. Yeah,
it's perfect. I think we'll probably touch on misusing emojis a bit more later on in the call. As for me, my favorite emoji is the thumbs up. It's a classic. It's straightforward. It saves me a lot of typing in a lot of cases. So it's probably the one I use the most. I'm curious what people listening in's thoughts are there. So feel free to pop your favorite emojis into the chat too. We'd love to see them. All right, so let's dive into the research. The first thing we're going to look at is we're going to look at industries and look at which industries are driving reactions on Facebook. So this is a subset of the overall 20 billion posts. In this case, we're looking at Facebook reactions. And this is over the first 6 months of 2021. So there's definitely some coloring from the pandemic in here as well, which I think is topical and important we're looking at right now. So let's jump into the data. The first thing, as you see this big blue section of the pie chart here, is as far as share volume of reactions, entertainment absolutely dominates. Entertainment's always done very well, but we'll talk about that in a bit, but it's definitely grown over the pandemic. So this is looking at volume. When we break it down by share of emotions, entertainment not only has very high volume, it also has the second highest, it's also the second highest as far as positive sentiment goes. So a key takeaway here is if you're not in the entertainment space, it doesn't mean you have to throw your hands up and say, you know what, we're kind of have our hands tied behind our backs. We're not going to generate a lot of reactions online. We're going to benchmark ourselves lower. We're going to set our sites lower. You don't need to do anything like that. Take advantage of it. It's something we do at BuzzSumo. I think a lot of marketers, I know we do it in the Brandwatch and Falcon teams too as well, is we write content that targets that audience. Like I'll give you a very recent example. We wrote an article to analyze the Love Island results using BuzzSumo data. And we see a lot of engagement when we do that. We see a lot of people who read that post. We actually got some nice comments back from people when we write that type of content. So you can take advantage of the fact that entertainment generates reactions on Facebook and write content that targets that audience. And Ksenia and Shruti, I'm curious if you guys have thoughts around this data.
Yeah, absolutely. In a recent study by the United Talent Agency Research, I actually learned that 84% of respondents said that they spend more time with entertainment during the pandemic than in the previous year. And 67% of people actually said that they're planning on spending or consuming more entertainment in a post-pandemic world. So it definitely makes sense for brands to kind of keep an eye on that and make sure their strategies are aligned with the audience interests. Definitely.
What I'd like to add there, and this is again calling back to what you were talking about, Evan, and of course, it always boils back down to the pandemic, right? 2020 and 2021. And the whole thing about it, it's like face-to-face interactions are down, people are depending on entertainment more, and there's been this massive shift in media consumption. Like, why else would we have watched Tiger King, right? Like that's just one simple example. Like we've all kind of depended on comfort watches over the pandemic. And one thing that I'd like to add there is that it's not just the entertainment industry that should rejoice basically over this fact that people are reacting to entertainment content more. It's actually good news for a lot of us. And like BuzzSumo itself, there's a lot of brands which need not be from the entertainment industry, which can still piggyback on it. And there's also been a shift from traditional to entertainment marketing. So product placements, influencer marketing, live streaming, they're all options that you could be trying. And it's not dependent on the vertical you're from. So that's definitely a great insight to take away from this slide as well.
Perfect. That's really interesting. I think we all look back at what we did in the past year and a half and kind of wonder at some of our choices or if things would have been successful outside of the pandemic. And again, this data is looking at a subset from BuzzSumo focusing on Facebook, but we also looked at it through the lens of Brandwatch. And this is where we analyzed 20 billion emojis. And I'll turn it over to you, Ksenia, to talk a bit more about this.
Sure. We looked into this very same 5 large market sectors and analyzed social data related to the top companies within each sector. And the chart that you see on your screens really shows how conversation about each sector differed in the first 6 months of 2021. As you can see, entertainment and fashion had the highest percentage of joyful mentions, and consumer tech brands had the highest portion of angry mentions. And lastly, the financial services, unsurprisingly, had the highest portion of said mentions in the first 6 months of this year.
Perfect. I think this is something that doesn't surprise us that people are angry at financial services. We've all seen that sentiment a lot lately, but it's good to see the data back it up. And consumer tech almost surprised me at first. I think people have a lot of positive emotions around brands like Apple, but probably also a lot of frustration when their iPhone freezes and locks up on them. And I think it's probably what we're seeing in a lot of these posts here.
Yeah, 100%. And I also feel like it's probably an add-on for me. I feel like when you're really happy, you don't really go online and say that you're happy with your whatever you just bought, right? But when you're unhappy, you're looking for that customer support on social media. So you go online and you really complain. And I'm guilty of doing that too. So I'm really not surprised to see this data.
That's a really good point. I think we've all done that at one time or another. Perfect. So next up, we're going to jump and talk about topics. We talk about industries as far as reactions go, but what topics drive reactions? And the results probably won't surprise you too much. People use the love reaction. Again, this is just a Facebook subset of data right now. BTS came up the most. They've absolutely owned the internet over the past 2 years. So that really shouldn't surprise anybody, but it's surprising they beat out dogs and babies. I mean, that's a real following. Just dogs and babies are always the classic #1 and #2. And what's interesting about this is I don't think these results should shock you, but I think it just drives home the importance of looking at your brands, your industries, and understanding what emotions people have regarding that type of content, how people react to that type of content, and what type of content generates the most reactions overall. You know, what emotions will generate the most engagement. We run a case study recently. I don't want to spend too much time here because we have a really great video and case study about it with Luke from Rides at 7, where they talk about how they take advantage of this. It's just really genuinely, really interesting that they look at a topic and they try to understand what emotions within that topic generate the most reactions, that generate the most engagement. And then they tailor their content to try to elicit that emotion, that emotional response from the target audience. So we're going to put some links to this in the chat and we'll send it with some follow-up content, but it's really interesting. It's really worth taking a look at if you're in the content space. So next up, let's talk about how do we feel in the first 6 months of 2021. I mean, this kind of takes us back in a time capsule to January. Kind of put yourself in that mind space of how things start off in January, how things end off in June. And I'll let Ksenia kind of walk through this a bit.
Sure, thank you. As we reviewed social data using Brandwatch consumer research, joy actually turned out to be the most frequent emotion shared by users on social this year. And if you go to the next slide, please. If you look at this chart, you can see that joy has also experienced the most growth, increased by 8% in terms of mention volume when compared to the previous period of time. And then the second runner-up was the surprise emotion with 1% of growth. And the emotions of disgust, sadness, and fear, actually, on the other hand, were down in comparison to the previous 6 months, which may or may not suggest that the internet may be feeling a little bit better, calmer this time around. And that's kind of the hope.
I think it's interesting because, when you look back at like where we were based for a normal year, there's still a lot of frustration, but 2021 compared to 2020, the last few weeks and the Delta stuff notwithstanding, has felt a lot better. So it's really interesting to see the data backs that out, that there is a huge, relatively, because you don't see these type of spikes typically. So this is relatively a huge spike in joyful reactions and that decrease in those disgust, sadness, and fear.
Yeah, absolutely.
We might have another research project ahead of us though to see how that's been impacted the last couple months with everything going on.
And it's always good to compare this data to the previous year, actually. So when you look at 2020, you can see that, first of all 6 emotions experienced massive growth, right? With 4 out of 6 seeing a growth over 40%. And the joyful sentiment, as you can tell from this chart, had the lowest of all emotions, actually at 36%. So yeah, again, hopefully this year we're feeling just a little bit more happier, a little bit more optimistic.
It's really interesting. I think it points out that social media turns into an echo box sometimes. It almost surprised me so much to see what a high percentage or proportion of this data was, anger, sadness, disgust, but it tracks. It was 2020. Hopefully we see that the 8% increase and then we keep increasing from there in the joyful posts. So next up, we're going to talk a bit about how people are using emojis online.
So we looked at close to 20 billion emojis shared in public social posts in the last 6 months to kind of find out how they're being used in conversations among consumers, by different demographics, as well as by brands and public-facing communications. And the chart that you see on your screens right now is featuring the top 10 most used emojis in the first 6 months of 2021. With the loudly crying face emoji actually dominating it. So as you can see, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, sorry, go for it.
I was just going to say that 8 out of 10 of these emojis actually shared positive sentiment. And again, that's kind of giving us a little bit more hope that 2021 is looking up.
And we're going to talk about this a bit more in a second. That surprised me. And there's probably a reason that this one surprised me so much. We'll look at some age breakdowns in a second. Because the loudly crying face kind of snuck up on me. And I'll cop to thinking it was almost negative when it first started coming up, but it seems more associated with like the laughing joy face. And I think we talked about this. Yeah, is the #1 most used emoji so far this year. So we're gonna have a quick poll, kind of get some engagement, make sure everyone's paying attention. It should pop up on your screen in a second. And the question is, which emoji is used most by 41 to 56-year-olds. So I think this is Gen X. Someone correct me if I'm wrong. So for Gen X, which emoji is the most popular between the heart emoji, the high five emoji, crying emoji, and crying with laughter emoji? The poll's open up right now. I'll keep it open for another few seconds here, 20 seconds or so. I'm seeing the results streaming too, so fairly interesting so far. All right, let's end that poll. I'm going to share the results. And if the answer everyone gave was the heart emoji won, it beat out the second place, which would be crying with laughter emoji. And we're looking at Gen X here. And that you guys hit the nail on the head. You got it right. Congratulations. The heart was the most used emoji there. But this is really interesting data. I think of everything we pulled during the study, I think this is the most interesting one because, I'll turn over to you to talk about this in depth, but this honestly surprised me to see these massive differences in the different age groups.
Yeah, absolutely. So we use pre-built social panels in Brandwatch consumer research to kind of dive deeper and analyze the usage of emojis between different generations. And as you can tell, the data is very, very different. And as far as I remember from my research, actually, in terms of the mention volume, Gen Z used 5.3 million emojis in the first 6 months of 2021, kind of the time period that we were looking at, in comparison to other generations, which was probably 2 or 3 times as much as other generations. So yeah, that also speaks to the fact that they're just as much more engaged online than anybody else. But yeah, I think Shruti has a little bit more insight in terms of how different generations use it.
Yes, I do. And yeah, speaking of Gen Z, this is actually a running joke with us, but the fact that I'm always interpreting Gen Z lingo for our report, we've been doing this since the emoji report and then now the webinar. But yeah, I'm going to do that again in this webinar. But funnily enough, people kind of tend to lump millennials and Gen Z together quite a lot. But if you looked at their emoji usage, it changes quite a lot. Actually, we don't really have way too many emojis in common, and you'll notice that the tears of joy emoji is what millennials use the most. But if you use TikTok, you would have noticed that earlier this year, Gen Z users kind of declared that the tears of joy emoji was cancelled, along with the side part and skinny jeans. So if you need me, I'll be discussing that in therapy. But anyway, I'm just kidding. But yeah, they kind of came up with this idea that you're out of touch if you use the tears of joy emoji, and instead Gen Z kind of prefers to use the crying face emoji. And like Evan said, it doesn't actually mean something negative. It's apparently a super positive way of using the emoji. And according to Gen Z, and I think I kind of side with them on this one, but the crying face emoji is super versatile. Like, you use it to bring the drama, so to speak. So like if you want to express excitement, if you want to express frustration, anger, like it literally works for everything. Like I could go on Twitter right now and tweet, "This webinar is so good," along with 3 crying faces, and my Gen Z followers would probably agree with me on that one. But anyway, yeah, side note, if you want to tweet about this, I think Luis actually mentioned something in chat about it. So like go check that out. But coming back to how Gen Z uses emoji, the third emoji for Gen Z that you'd notice here is the pleading face emoji. And that was introduced only a couple of years back, and Gen Z has already accepted it. And they actually use it so much to the point where it's figured in their top 5 emojis. And on a more personal note, I'm not very keen on that emoji. It looks a little creepy to me, but it could also be because when when you're on your iPhone and if you type "please sir," that's the emoji that shows up. So like do with that information what you will, but that's basically the split up between millennials and Gen Z and how they use their different emojis.
Yeah, I think this is such interesting data. And I think you guys just hit the nail on the head as far as the analysis goes. And the takeaway for me was if you're trying to reach a specific audience, or I should say you have to know which audience you're trying to reach first. Because if you're going to use emojis in your posts, and they do have a positive correlation with engagement, so you should be using them, you have to use the right ones. I fall firmly into Gen Y. Gen Z mystifies me in a lot of ways. And my top used emojis on social media are these first 3 here. I would never use the laughing crying face, but as Shruti pointed out, if you use, I use the laughing crying face, not the crying face. If you use the laughing crying face, you might be dating yourself. Your audience might see that as inauthentic. If you use the fire emoji, which again, I'm guilty of, a Gen Z audience might see that as effective. A Gen X might question that. They like kind of like the basics. They like the heart emoji. So just make sure you know which audience you're trying to reach, and then tailor your emoji usage to them as best you can. And I think we found an article recently after we started putting this together, we thought really tied this together nicely. So we just wanted to share it as a resource. It's from the Wall Street Journal, talking about how emoji meaning can be ambiguous as well. People can translate them in different ways and have different takes on the same emoji. Next up, we want to talk a bit about how companies are using emojis in their brand comms. And Sunny, I'll turn it over to you to dive into this data a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm actually still not over the fact about the pleading emoji. I'm not an iPhone user, I'm a Samsung Galaxy user, but I can't wait to actually test it out on my phone, off topic. Yeah, we examined verified Twitter accounts that belong to organizations and have a following of over 100,000 people. And this kind of enabled us to get a look at how big organizations are using emojis in their public-facing communications with consumers. And as you can see from this chart, the heart emoji, the collision emoji, and the pair of eyes emojis are the three top most used emojis by brands with larger following. So we kind of dove deeper to see whether we could uncover some patterns in how these brands are using it. And if you go into the next slide, we can talk a little bit about each one of them. So when it comes to the heart emoji, it turns out it's often used by brands when they try to thank their fans for their support online. And the collision emoji, which is on the next slide, the collision emoji is often used by brands in terms of when the brands are trying to build anticipation. So for example, if you look at your screens, you see that there's a tweet on the left side by Pokemon brand. And clearly the brand is trying to set a reminder and remind people and just kind of build this anticipation that something else is coming up. And then the other tweet also talks a little bit about the next season that's coming up, also kind of building that anticipation on the consumers and making sure that people are there, they're aware, and they're following and waiting for it. And the last emoji that we looked into is the pair of eyes emoji, which is frequently used to kind of fuel interest and invite people to learn more. And you can see on your screens a couple of examples by Venmo, for example. They're trying to really fuel that interest and introduce a new brand, I believe, or a new feature.
I'm muted. Next up, talk about emojis and representation.
So if you ever wondered how many emojis are out there, the count varies depending on the source, but most sources actually say it's around 3,300. New emojis are being added fairly regularly. For example, in June of this year, Statista reported that 34 emojis actually, new emojis were released last year. And when we looked into the conversation, including new emoji back to January 2020, we were able to find the new and upcoming releases that sparked a lot of interest online. So for example, many of the newly released emojis feature more inclusive designs. On January 29th this year, actually last year, I'm sorry, Emojipedia reported a new emoji release for the transgender flag. As you can see on your screens right now. The tweet was retweeted close to 9,000 times and liked by over 35,000 people. And of all the new emojis released in 2020, the trans flag has gained a lot of popularity, getting the second most engagement of all emojis announced by Emojipedia. Is something that we actually looked into as well. And brands actually jumped on this trend as well. So they contributed to this by using this new emoji in their posts around the International Transgender Day of Visibility. So for example, Ulta brand, as you can see on your screens, celebrated this day and featured the trans flag emoji. And it has become one of the most engaged posts from January to June 2021, something that we saw in our data. And this kind of gives you the opportunity to show your support as a brand. So for brands out there, it makes sense to keep an eye on the new emoji releases, especially when it comes to inclusivity and representation. But also an advice here would be to really be mindful and try to be a little bit more authentic when you use these emojis. And I think that's going to allow you to create that bond with your consumers. Oh yeah, and we did research around the topic of whether people felt represented by emojis. And again, while the sample size was relatively small, we were looking at people who literally said, I feel represented or I don't feel represented. But you can see from this pie chart right there that a lot more people felt that they felt represented by the existing emojis versus people who felt that they were not represented. However, while many of them claim that they feel represented, we also looked into the last 2 years of data, and we found that the demand for more representation as self-expression emojis has been increasingly growing among consumers online.
I think it's really interesting. It kind of goes together nicely with the fact that but there were, you said 334 new emojis created last year. So hopefully that the demand's still there. I think hopefully this green part of the chart, and we circle back in the year, let's say, is a bit more than 2/3 as they create more emojis to represent more people. Perfect. And Shruti, I'm going to turn over to you for some takeaways you had from this research.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so the main point is that we've looked at a whole lot of charts. So what can we as marketers take away from this? There are a lot of nuggets of gold here that I think we should be paying attention to. And one of the main actionable insights basically is that emoji is also a social signal for you. So on top of your likes, comments, and shares, you should be looking at emojis as well. And especially when it comes to social intelligence, you should be taking a look at how people are emoting online, and that kind of gets you this insight into how people are reacting to your products and services, and what is people's mental state, what is their emotional state, and it just gives you a lot of data that you can parse. And if you move on to the next slide, you'll notice why it is actually important to take a look at emojis as a social signal. It's because it helps you measure brand sentiment. And of course, it's only to a certain degree of accuracy, but you should be paying attention to emojis nonetheless, because even in this very webinar, we've spoken a lot about reaction data and how we kind of assigned if it's positive or negative. And that's the kind of information you really need about your audience. And it helps you understand what their sentiment is towards your brand, towards your products, towards your services. You really want to know what the emotional state of your followers are, and it's going to help you out in your own social posts and your own marketing communications. And I really think that's one of the main takeaways from this research. And if you move on to the next slide, I have a wild suggestion as well. And that's basically about the importance of digitalization. When we started this webinar, we were talking about how entertainment inspired the most joyous reactions. And I think the other industry on that chart was also fashion. Obviously, we keep circling back to the pandemic as a reason for that. So with the pandemic, with face-to-face interactions coming down, everything shifted to virtual, right? And if you looked at the fashion and if you looked at the entertainment industries, they kind of had to pivot their marketing strategies to go fully virtual, and they still managed to inspire joyous reactions amongst their audience. And that kind of really speaks to digitalization. In fact, one of the biggest takeaways from the pandemic itself and our response to it, other than the widespread sickness and government incompetence, I said what I said, but the most important takeaway from the pandemic itself is the importance of digitalization, the importance of building strong virtual relationships with your consumers. And I think this research also kind of shows that, because all the verticals that did manage to go digital, go on demand, go virtual, they all managed to inspire joyous reactions from their customers. And I really think that that's an important takeaway here. If you moved on to the next slide, we're going to stick to the marketing topic now. So what do you do if you want to incorporate emojis in your marketing? I have 4 tips for you. The very first one being that you should build your brand image with an emoji. So the very first example here is Taco Bell. So I don't know how many of you remember this, but a few years back, there was no taco emoji, which is such a shame, right? Because I love tacos. But anyway, there was no taco emoji, and Taco Bell came up with this campaign where they launched this petition and people had to sign it to get the taco emoji included in our phones, basically, in our emoji, in our collection of emojis, basically. And not only did their petition succeed because we have a taco emoji now, they also use the taco emoji quite a lot in their comms on social media. And you cannot scroll through Taco Bell's social channels without encountering a taco emoji there. And the same applies for Domino's as well. They use the pizza emoji a lot. There's McDonald's with the fries emoji. There's Burger King with the burger emoji. And I understand that literally all my examples are fast food chains. So a very valid question that you may have here is, what do I do if I don't have an emoji that reflects what I sell? And my only answer to you is that building a brand image with emoji, it doesn't actually depend on having an emoji replica of what you sell. you just need to find the emoji that reflects who you are as a brand. And it's okay if it's not tacos and pizzas that you sell, even if it's insurance products, or I don't know, any kind of boring topic. Basically, as others would say, you don't need an exact replica of your industry or of what you sell in emojis. It just has to reflect who you are as a brand. Another example is on the next slide. And yes, there you go. Yeah, so this one has to do with asking open-ended questions. If you are only partially listening to this webinar, if you're scrolling through Instagram, we've all been there. So like, that's totally fine. But if you are scrolling through Instagram, I would highly recommend pulling up any personal care brand, like maybe go to Bath and Body Works or Sephora or Lush, any of their Instagram handles. And I swear that there will be at least one recent post where they've asked an open-ended question there. Like, I'm not even kidding. I actually did try this out myself. This is something personal care brands do a lot, but there are other verticals as well that come in here. They basically ask an open-ended question, which requires an emoji response. So it could be as simple as drop a heart if this is a lipstick that you would try, or drop a firecracker emoji if you think that this makeup look is something that you'd totally wear to a hot date. Or even, the example from F1 on this slide, where they're asking you to react to something and you get to pick which emoji you want to react with. So these are all really cool ideas that a lot of brands use. It is kind of engagement bait, but it works for them, which is why such a huge number of brands are using it. And it's really cool because it also helps you understand where your brand stands. It gets your audience to kind of react with their emotional reaction, basically. But it gives you insight into audience sentiment. And would I recommend doing this every single day? Probably not. But I would recommend maybe trying this out on a dry day when you're running out of captions to try on Instagram, because clearly if it's working for all these brands, it just might work for you as well. And on the next slide, there's another tip about paid advertising. There was actually this recent report from Adobe where they said that 42% of users would buy from a brand if it advertised the product with their favorite emoji. And what would be their favorite emojis? I would just recommend going back a few slides to see what the internet's favorite emojis are. And I really think that using emojis in your paid ads, irrespective of this research, is really important, because emojis, they humanize your brand. They add this splash of color to your social posts. It kind of draws your eye. This example from Falcon is for a summit that we have coming up next week. We've used a clock emoji there because of that. And obviously, yeah, it kind of breaks up your text nicely. It adds color to your posts. And I really think that using emojis in your paid ads could help out. And of course, I would recommend testing it, because sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, right? So for us at Falcon IO, it works. Like, we like using emojis in our ads, and we also see more clicks when we use emojis in our advertisements. But you can, of course, test it to see how your audience reacts and what works for you. Should you go for an emoji or should you not use one? I would recommend testing it. And on the next slide, you have my final example for emoji use, and that's to do with Twitter hash flags. Hash flags are these custom Twitter hashtags that you might have noticed. They have this emoji towards the end. Other hashtags don't have that, which is why these are called hash flags. You'll notice this example from Apple about WWDC 2021. And hash flags, they're kind of created around special events, occasions, if it's a new TV show, or if it's something like WWDC or a very big brand's event, basically. And they kind of increase brand recall, they increase brand awareness, and they're ephemeral, so that adds to the excitement of using hash flags online as well. But of course, they are not used by every single brand. Why is that? It's because Twitter doesn't disclose how much they cost, but we can kind of guess that they probably cost a pretty penny, right? So what do you do if you want to use hash flags without breaking the bank? you do what Penguin Random House is doing on the right-hand side here. So they noticed that Loki Wednesdays was trending, and I don't think a publisher has anything to do with Loki, but they figured out a way to relate it to their brand, and they tweeted out a thread of book recommendations, especially for fans of the series. And I think that's really cool. Piggybacking is totally valid in marketing. It's going to get you the engagement without you actually spending money on it. And it's already a trending hashtag, or hash flag rather. And you kind of get to participate in it without spending too much money on it. And I think that's a really cool idea that you can try as well. If you move on to the next slide, that's my final set of tips for today. If you do decide to use emoji more in your marketing and in your social media, the very first tip that I would recommend is that there is a time and place for emoji use. Now, we don't think that using emoji is this frivolous. We wouldn't have written a whole report or conducted a whole webinar about it. But if you do decide to use emojis, you do need to see what kind of post you're using it in, and does it warrant using emojis there? Because sometimes you could be tweeting out something that's super serious. You could be empathizing with a global crisis, for instance. And I think using emojis there would really water down the message that you're trying to put across. So obviously a good rule of thumb would be to check if an emoji would fit there. Would it look like you're kind of being out of touch, and it's going to look problematic if you use way too many emojis and kind of water down your message. The second tip that I have to offer is that you should research your audience, understand what flies with them, what emojis do they use, and do you want to use their lingo? Because the language that your audience uses, if you use it, it kind of works well, right? You mirror their language, and that works well for you as well. And of course, a research like this is going to help you understand what your audience uses, and you can mirror it in your own communications. The next tip I'd like to offer is that context is key. Not all emojis mean the same. They add emotional context to your text, basically. But the context also really matters. Some emojis don't exactly, they're not exactly benign. A peach isn't a peach. An eggplant isn't an eggplant. So, like, be really mindful of what emojis mean before using them. Incidentally, Evan, you mentioned that the thumbs up emoji was your favorite. Not to put you on the spot, but it does offend certain cultures. So maybe you might want to look into that. But anyway, I'm just kidding. We do tend to use the thumbs up emoji a lot. And speaking of being mindful, I personally do use the thumbs up emoji a lot at work as well. But I have noticed that a lot of people actually consider the thumbs up emoji to be dismissive. And yeah, I don't know what's up with that. So maybe that's a good exercise for chat. So like, tell us how you use the thumbs up emoji. Do you just mean +1, or are you actually being dismissive or, like rude or something using the thumbs up emoji? Speaking of being mindful, you do need to be mindful of cultural differences. Emojis don't mean the same across the globe. So if you are a global brand, probably Google emojis first to see what they mean across different countries, so that if there is something offensive, an offensive meaning that they have, you could skip that emoji and basically go for something else. And finally, I would recommend testing repeatedly. I know I already touched upon this when we spoke about paid advertising. And in addition to that, you also kind of need to look into the aesthetics of emojis as well, because they don't look the same across different devices. Incidentally, I got a new Windows laptop for the first time a while back, and I hated all the emojis on it. And I think I had to put up with it for like 2 weeks. And oh my God, that's such a first world problem. But yes, emojis look weird across platforms. Not everyone likes how they look across different platforms. So if it looks different, if the aesthetic of it looks weirder, or if the design itself changes across different platforms or different networks, you really need to be mindful of that before you use them in one of your social communications. A good resource here would be Emojipedia, because any single emoji that you look up on Emojipedia, it kind of lists how the emoji looks across different networks and platforms. So that would be really cool to check out as well. And that's pretty much it from me when it comes to actionable insights for marketeers. And yeah, hope this helped.
Yeah, I think there's excuse me, I think there was a lot of really interesting points in there that tied in with a lot of the research we did. So it was great to have that takeaway. And we'll make sure we send a copy of these slides to everybody and a copy of the presentation that attended. I think we've cut up in a lot of really interesting insights in it as well. So we want to make sure we get them over to you. And on that note, we'll make sure you download the report. There's a lot of interesting stuff in there. I feel like we just brushed the surface in a lot of ways. We talk about breakdowns by countries as far as reactions and emoji usage, and also sentiments around different topics, how usage of the top emojis has changed over time, what the trend line looks like, what emojis people use around different companies, differences between gender splits, which are also really interesting. So we just tapped on age differences, but there's a lot of differences in emoji usage. So we're gonna make sure we send you a copy of this along with the deck later on this week. But if you want to get the report now, you can also go to brandwatch.com and download it. So I want to thank everyone for joining, and we have a couple minutes left, so we'll make sure we take some questions. Except questions, pop them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. I can see that it looks like a few have come through as well. The first one, which we may have answered a little bit, I can see is why do the responses to tech look angry? I could take this one myself. I think part of it is consumer tech. I think we touched on it a bit, and I can't remember who responded that. A lot of us go online to complain. So we're talking about consumer tech specifically. A lot of those results are people going in and saying, hey, my so-and-so broke. It's a lot of cases looking for a response, looking for someone to come and help them fix it or get them to the customer care team. But there's also a lot of frustration bubbling around the big tech companies in privacy and security. And we see a lot of that. Those stories do really well on social media. We get a ton of engagement, they generate a lot of conversation. So we see a lot of those stories as well. People are very mistrustful of big tech, and with consumer tech, people kind of go to reach out when they have questions. Let's go through a couple more. If we can't get through to everything, we'll try to make sure we respond to them later on. Is there an emoji dictionary? I was using the big, is there an emoji dictionary? I believe, I'll turn this over to you, Shruti or Ksenia. I believe there is like a governing board that oversees like the general emojis. Is that the case?
I think so, but if you are looking for a good resource about emojis, I would recommend Emojipedia, though. That's what I usually depend on. But as for whether there's a governing body, I feel like Ksenia would be able to take this one. I think there was an organization we were discussing.
Yeah, I'm there with you. I go to Emojipedia for to get the knowledge that I need. Like I did earlier today, and I found out that I've been using this emoji all wrong the entire time. But there are a couple of different resources that I like, but I also like Imagination. And this organization actually their mission is to fight for inclusivity and representation in emojis. So you could always go to Imagination to kind of learn a little bit more about the inclusive emojis, like transgender flag as well. They did a couple of emojis that are very culturally representative. So I go between these two resources. I think these are the best probably, but there are definitely a lot more out there. But yeah, Emojipedia and Imagination, I would say those are the two.
Nice. That's interesting. So Emojipedia, everybody, is I think the emoji dictionary. It sounds like. Another question that came in is like using emojis. How much is too much? And Shruti, I'll turn this one over to you. And I'm sure it depends a bit on the brand, but in the brand stance and the brand's image. But I'm curious if you have a take there.
Yeah, I do actually. So if you think about this from the end user point of view, right? Put yourself in the shoes of your end user. What do you think they are going to like looking at in your social posts, or if it's a brand? And it obviously depends on the brand itself. If they actually tend to toe the line and kind of use a lot of emojis, maybe it works. But typically the rule of thumb would be to tone it down just a bit, because if there's way too many emojis, it kind of confuses the message as well. So unless you're participating in any meme that's going around, there are a lot of these tweets that kind of go around where you kind of participate in a kind of meme that everyone goes forward and does. In fact, there's this very cool example from Buffalo Wild Wings, I think, where they put up a whole bunch of beer emojis for National Beer Day. And it was basically a game that they came up with. They asked their followers to quote tweet it and take down a beer and pass it on so that more people could participate in it. In that case, using multiple emojis makes total sense. Whereas if it were some other message, right? If it were a normal tweet, maybe you're tweeting out one of your recent blog posts, maybe don't add more than a couple of emojis. I would just say one is enough, but obviously it depends on your audience. Do some research, see what they like. If you have a lot of baby boomers as your audience, maybe don't use way too many emojis. But if you have Gen Z, also maybe don't use too many emojis, because you could end up like Steve Buscemi and end up, with the whole how do you do, fellow kids. You don't want that to happen. You don't want to end up on Reddit. So a good rule of thumb would be to just do some audience research to figure out what works for them.
Nice. And I think this might be the last question, just because I think we're going over time a little bit. But a question came in about inclusivity when using emojis, particularly when it comes to screen readers. And I could add my take in there, and I'm curious, Shruti, what your thoughts are there too. It's a tricky issue. I think that you have to be something we should all be thoughtful about, inclusivity in general. But you just make sure you're using the emojis in context, right? I think screen readers, like I said, you might have said this in the chat as well, some screen readers can actually read out the emoji. So you want to make sure there's some content to your post sometimes, right? So people can read it on screen readers. And it's not just emojis. That might get tricky. That might be hard if someone's visually impaired. But there are ways to kind of be thoughtful about it and work through it. Curious if you guys have anything to add there.
No, I think you've covered it. But yeah, I do believe that screen readers can read out emojis, at least from what I've used in the past. Like I have used screen readers occasionally. They can read out emojis. But speaking of accessibility, more than emojis, I think we need to be concerned about the images that we add to tweets and Instagram posts, because alt text is a functionality that you have available. I would add that as well. Whereas for emojis, I do believe that you can, screen readers can adapt and read out what the emoji itself is.
Yeah, I agree with Shruti. I actually don't know whether screen readers can read emojis or not. Something that I'd like to test, because I use screen readers quite a bit myself. But I imagine that at some point, if they can't read it right now, I imagine at some point in the future, soon in the future, they'll be able to read emojis, because just like Shruti mentioned, alt text is important when you're adding images to your website or to social media for people who may not be able to actually see the screen. I think at some point emojis will be part of that, if not already. So yeah, definitely the name of emoji, the properly named emojis should be able to be read at some point, if not already.
Gotcha. So I think we're gonna sign off for the day. We're a little bit over time, so thank you for joining us. I did see some questions coming in. Apologies if we did not answer your question. I saw some coming in about the data set overall. So please check out the report. It's going to have a lot more insights into all this data we're talking about, and a lot more information on the data set itself. And we'll make sure we follow up and send that to you. But if we didn't get to your questions, just please reach out. We're always accessible. We're happy to talk to you and answer any questions you have. But we hope that this was entertaining, but more importantly, I hope you got some really key insights from what we talked about today. And remember, we will follow up. We will send a copy of this presentation. We will send a copy of the recording, and we'll send you a copy of that research report as well. But thanks for joining us. We really appreciate your time, and it's great speaking with everybody.